G'day, Growth Group leaders. Week 6 in Job. We're looking at the ending of the book of Job. Last week, we saw the climactic resolution of the book of Job, which is God speaks to Job. He answers him, not with the reasons for his suffering precisely, but with the fact of God's sovereign and complete rule over all things in creation in righteousness and justice. So trust God in all things and be humble before him. This week, off the back of that resolution, we just see how things get tied up. All the loose ends get tied up, and we see resolution in other smaller ways in the book. So it's like the Lord of the Rings. Spoiler alert, surely it's okay to say. But the ring gets thrown into the fires of Mordor, it's destroyed, the armies collapse, it's resolved, the battle's won. But we still have scene after scene wrapping up and bringing small resolutions to relationships that are reunited, back to Hobbiton, things like that. So that's what's happening here at the end of the book of Job. Things are getting wrapped up after the resolution. This will feel like our last week in Job because we're hitting the end of the book, but we're actually dipping back into chapter 28 next week for a topical one on wisdom to line up with Father's Day. We've skipped through that, but that's a chapter that stands alone on its own, but really helpful for the book of Job. So we will be back in Job next week. So the content of this chapter, we'll go through that, and then we'll hit on the two sections of the study really quickly at the end. So we've already seen the beginning of chapter 42 last week, which is Job's repentance, admitting that God has power of all things, that Job has limited knowledge, that he speaks without knowledge, admitting fault there and repenting. Then we have verse 7 and 8, God critiques Job's friends, he rebukes them, says that they're foolish, that they act in folly, and that they don't speak the truth about God, but also vindicates Job. So have a look, verse 7. I'm angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. So they have not spoken the truth about God. There's the rebuke. But there's a vindication of Job. Job has spoken the truth about me. And the same thing happens again in verse 8. He says, go to Job and so that I won't deal with you according to your folly. So you've been foolish. For you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. So there it is again. That's interesting because we have a dialogue that we've observed, and we've known that both people are saying true things and both groups of people are saying wrong things, drawing wrong conclusions. And yet, and to add to that, we've seen God rebuke Job and say, who are you to say that I'm unjust? So there have been things that make this an interesting vindication of Job. And that's an interesting question to ponder. How is it that Job has spoken the truth about God where his friends have not? And there's going to be some questions in the study for that. It's worth reflecting on, discussing, using what you've seen in Job, the book of Job so far, the beginning and the end, to answer that question as best you can. Then God tells his friends to go seek forgiveness through Job, to go sacrifice a burnt offering and ask Job to pray. And God says, I'll accept his prayer and forgive you. And that's what happens. And then lastly, God brings about abundant blessing on Job. He restores him, his reputation, his fortune, twice the wealth that he had before. It's this abundance of blessing is how the story finishes. And it's almost like that's the material representation of his vindication in all of this. And that's how the story wraps up. Now, the study is simple. It's two parts. One, thinking about the ending, so asking questions that are helpful for us to reflect on how this book ends, and then think about the book as a whole. So how does the ending contribute and help us reflect on the whole book? So thinking about the ending, there's questions like how do you feel about it, how have things concluded, and then that big discussion question, how is it that God affirms Job here, with some follow-up questions there. What could we learn from that, from God's vindication of Job? And then part 2, thinking about the book as a whole, we want to relate Job's experience to Jesus's. How does Job remind us of Jesus, not remind us? How does that grow our love for Jesus? How is Job's experience like ours as a Christian? How is it different? What do we gain having read the book of Job as Christians today? There's a good follow-up question here that I highly recommend, which is chasing up James 5:7-11, and ask what fresh insight do we get into this New Testament passage by what we've read in the Old Testament. I think as Christians we can too quickly think, let's just be New Testament, let's read. But the Old Testament actually adds such a richness to what we read and understand of the gospel in the person of Jesus. So there's some great verses to look at there that remind you of the end of Job here very explicitly. And then just some final application questions about how we want the book of Job and our time in Job to have shaped us, how we think about life, how we deal with suffering, how we engage with God in that. So it'd be a good time to reflect over the book as a whole and your time as a group as a whole. And I trust there'll be lots of prayer and praise and thanksgiving to come out of that into prayer time as a group. So enjoy your time finishing off the book of Job and your time as a group. Go well.